Thank you. So, when I speak about science and the faith, I often talk about zombie myths. You know, in the zombies, you chop off their heads and they reappear again. And the reason I call them zombie myths is because in this conversation, I think the public part of this conversation, there are many myths that keep reappearing, and even though you can chop at them really hard in all kinds of different ways, they don't seem to die. So here's the first myth, which is that scientists don't believe in God. So people will say scientists don't believe in God, therefore scientists are smart people, we should trust them, and ergo God does not exist. Now, maybe it's true that scientists don't believe in God. That doesn't necessarily mean that scientists are right. Scientists may have many false beliefs, right? So the idea that because a group of people don't believe in something, therefore it's wrong, is not necessarily a strong argument. But is that actually true? So here's a picture of a bunch of academics in Oxford that I work with. We have a course called Developing a Christian Mind. We're trying to help graduate students, so PhD students and master students, think critically about their subject. And one of the issues we do science, we do humanities, we do social sciences, and the easiest group for me to find speakers of, so Christian academic speakers, is in the sciences. There are a lot more Christians in the sciences than there are in the humanities or in the social sciences. So it's a myth. And I say sometimes people ask me, how can you be a Christian and a scientist? They think I'm a vegetarian butcher. Right? I'm selling something I don't really believe in. Right? I just think that's actually nonsense. If you look around the world, it's true that on average, scientists are less likely to be Christians than the general public is. But the fraction of them that are Christians or believing more or less follows the fractions of the populations that they're in. So, and there's many other reasons for example, people of non-religious background are more likely to go into science than people of religious backgrounds. So once you control for all those factors, the differences are not actually nearly as big as people think. That's the first zombie myth. The second zombie myth is that there's a history of conflict between science and religion. So this is taught in schools. Science and religion have been in conflict. And the story goes like this. We used to be living in these dark ages when we didn't know anything, and people believed in, they believed that thunder was caused by Zeus or Thor or all these kind of mythologies. Now we are enlightened people. We understand science. We're rational people, and science is part of that awakening of rationality. And in that history, the church, evil men with hoods tried to suppress the knowledge, but brave few free thinkers came out, and now we're living in this enlightened world. Well, this is a very attractive story. Who would not want to be on the side of the enlightened, free-thinking people on this how the story is told? It just is a myth. So here's Peter Harrison, who used to be at Oxford, is now in Queensland, one of the world's greatest historians, who said, those who argue for incompatibility in science and religion will draw little comfort from history. Okay, so in other words, those who argue for their conflict will find that history actually doesn't tell them that this is what happens. The myth of perennial conflict between science and religion is one to which no historian of science would subscribe. So, in fact, a bunch of historians and scientists got together about over 10 years ago and wrote a book called Galileo Goes to Jail and 25 other myths about science and religion. So 25 of the world's leading historians of science wrote this book. Many of them are not Christians or even atheists, but they actually talk about the conflict myth. And what's interesting is, even though all the best thinkers in this subject call this a myth, if you open your newspaper, you see it repeated again and again. If you on the school, on the classroom, you'll hear this again and again. Galileo, blah blah blah. All these stories are interesting stories, but conflict is the wrong way of thinking about it. The really interesting question is, why is this myth persisting? It's a zombie myth. We keep chopping at it, and it keeps coming up. And I think if I was a social scientist, I would be studying this question, because it's a question about how does disinformation, misinformation, why is it spread, and why is it so persistent in our culture? Have you guys recognize the conflict myth in Switzerland? Yeah, so people tell you that science and faith are in conflict, and they always have been in conflict. Very common view. It's unfortunately false, yeah, for those that like that view, but it's a very common view. The real history is not all of friendship. Christianity, for example, and science have had complicated relationship, but conflict is not the right way of thinking about it. And why is that relationship complicated? Well, the world is complicated, history is complicated, people thought lots of different things at different times, but conflict is not really the way of thinking about it. The next zombie myth is that believing in God is like believing in a pink unicorn or a flying teapot. Why do I use these words? Is because flying teapot is what a very famous philosopher called Bertrand Russell used, believing in God is like believing in a flying teapot. And Richard Dawkins has again, in beautiful language, a pink unicorn. So if you want to believe in teapots, unicorns, or tooth fairies, Thor or Yahweh, the onus is on you to say what you believe in. The onus is not on the rest of us to say why we do not. We who are atheists are also afairists, ateapotists, and aunicornists. We don't have to bother saying so. It's a nice piece of rhetoric. What he's saying is if you believe in God, the kind of God that we believe in, right, then that's not any different from these other things. And I call it the pink unicorn arguments because when the new atheists were very popular, they would talk about believing in God is like believing in a pink unicorn in your garden. They even like a youth camp where young people go away and they would pretend, have a game where they pretend there's a pink unicorn and then see if does evidence really show us a pink unicorn. There's no pink unicorn, ergo there is no God, is the arguments. That's the kind of light version of it. What this is really saying is something what people sometimes call evidentialism. It's the idea that you shouldn't believe anything unless you have evidence for it. This is a particular way of understanding things in philosophy called evidentialism. I should have no belief on something unless I'm given evidence for it. It sounds very plausible. Who would not want to be on the side of evidence? The problem and the reason why evidentialism is not that popular in philosophy as it used to be, is because there are many things that we believe for which that way of thinking about it doesn't really work. And God is the classic example. Because we don't believe in a God who is part of our natural world. God is not like a human being, only bigger and smarter. God is the reason why the universe exists. No God, no universe. You can't put God in this little space like you could a flying teapot or a big unicorn or any other thing that you find in science. If I can tell you there's a new virus I've discovered, you can take an evidentialist point of view and say, I don't believe you until you give me evidence for that virus. That's actually a very good stance to take. That stance doesn't work on things like the God who created the whole world because you can't separate God out from the world and look at God that way. Does that make sense? So here is a very famous writer on these topics called John Polkinghorne who wrote this. If we are to understand nature reality, we have two possible starting points: the brute fact of the physical world or the brute fact of a divine will and purpose behind that physical world. This is a fancy way of saying, actually, if you want to assess questions like whether there is a God or not, what you can't do, you've got to basically, what you can't do is take a neutral stance on it from the beginning, which is what Dawkins is assuming you do. What Dawkins is really doing is he's taking the assumption there is no God, and then taking that assumption and then trying to see if he can find evidence for a God. That sounds very plausible, but that's not the right intellectual way of thinking about questions like God. What you really need, the only thing you can do is say, let me assume there is a God, then let's look at the natural world or the physical or anything I care about and ask myself, do things I see make more sense in light of the fact that I'm assuming there is a God? Or I can assume there is no God, the world has no start, no finish, nothing else, and then see whether this makes more sense of the world. But what I can't do is assume there is no God and then ask you to put evidence for me. So that it's an asymmetry argument. So Dawkins says there's asymmetry. The asymmetry is you should assume there's no God unless I'm given evidence for God. It sounds very plausible. It sounds very reasonable. It sounds very like, oh, who would not believe that? But it's actually, if you think about it a little bit more, is an incorrect way of thinking about it. Does that make sense? I call that the asymmetry argument. And this is very often pulled out in various arguments. Subtle question, right? But let me give you one example of how this might play out. Let's ask ourselves questions like, why is there our universe? Or even a simple question, why are there the laws of nature that allow the universe to start? Okay, that's better than, I can say, I'm just going to ask myself, why are there laws of nature like physics that make universes? That avoids some tricky other questions. Well, there are basically three possibilities. Either the universe, the laws of physics, were caused by a previous set of laws of physics or something. what caused those? Well, some previous set caused those. And what caused those? Well, some previous set caused those. And so you have an infinite set of causes. That's possible, but very strange. What does it mean for an infinite set of, or an infinite history of causes? That's a strange thing, but it's possible. The second possibility is the laws of nature appeared out of what people call ontological nothingness. That means not nothing like a quantum vacuum, like some atheists are trying to argue about, but like nothing. So no laws of logic, no laws of mathematics, just boom, suddenly the laws of nature are there, and out of it came a universe. That's option number two. And option number three is there's something outside of the universe, something like a being who cannot not exist. Right? Cannot not exist, right? So a necessary being, which is the classic god of theism. Right? And that's where the laws of nature come from. Now that's also strange, right? But the point is, if you're an atheist, you've got to take one of those first two views, either the eternal set of laws of nature or they popped into being out of nothingness. Both of them are very strange. Both of them are non-scientific views. They're not, it's hard to know why they were true. Or you have to assume that there is a God behind the world. But one of those three is the one that you have to start with. Okay. Now, let's say I start with one of those two atheist options, either an infinite set of laws or ontological nothingness. Why would I see a universe that's ordered? Why would I not see a chaotic universe, for example? It's really surprising that we see a beautifully ordered universe. On theism, it's maybe not so surprising, but on atheism, it is surprising. So suddenly when you realize that the starting point for this argument is one of these initial kind of ways of thinking about the world, how you assess the evidence becomes very different. And if you're a Bayesian, you can think about this in Bayesian language. You're looking at the etc. But this is a subtle but super important argument. And one of the things that you see in this sounds very plausible. Okay, as a piece of rhetoric, it's very powerful. Who would not want to be on the side of evidence, right? So when you sometimes engage with somebody who believes this kind of stuff, it's very attractive to be on that side. It's unfortunately not intellectually very sound, right? But it feels like it is. Right? But you've got to think behind it. And these are subtle questions, no question about it. But the world is complicated, so it's not surprising that they're subtle questions. Then the next myth is science is the best avenue for truth about ultimate questions. I dealt with that a little bit in the Q&A. Why do we have why do we believe in fundamental human rights, for example? Science can't answer that question. I had a very good discussion. You asked me, what about morality, right? So we believe, for example, that torturing children for pleasure is wrong. Okay, why is that wrong? Okay, can science answer that question? No, science can't answer that question. Science can't answer a different question, which is, if I torture children for pleasure, does that cause pain? Yes, it does. Does that make the torturer less happy? Perhaps it does. Those are all things it can answer. But it can't answer whether it's right or wrong, or if I see it happening, should I intervene or not intervene? There's all kinds of questions that they're moral questions. They're not scientific questions. Science can help me sculpt the moral landscape in the sense of telling me whether something is bad or good, but it doesn't. Just like evolutionary arguments are very popular now for explaining the evolutionary arguments for morality. Now let's assume, for the sake of the argument, that these are correct. So let's say that there's a moral, that this evolutionary history is correct and it explains something moral. What does it explain? It only explains certain tendencies that I have, right? So I was telling you, I'll give you the same example. So sociologically and historically, males are much more likely to be unfaithful to their spouses than the other way around. And the evolution, this is something that's quite common in societies. It's quite stable in many societies, not always, but it is quite common. An evolutionary argument is, well, that's because male evolution wants you to maximize your offspring, and so males will do that. Females can't do it because they bear the cost of childbirth, and so it's hard for them to do so. And so they want you to be faithful because that's better for their offspring, right? And that's the evolutionary battle is true. Now let's assume that's true, okay? Let's say that's true. That may or may not be true. Does that tell me anything about whether it's right for me to be unfaithful to my wife or not? No, it just tells me maybe that if I'm male, I'm more likely to have those temptations than if I'm female. Right? I'm going to give you a completely different example. I'm brought up in a family with a father who cheats And am I more likely to cheat on my wife? Historically, or sociologically, yes. Okay. If I'm brought up in a very stable family where I'm taught from a very early age the importance of not cheating, I'm less likely to cheat. What's the difference between that argument and the evolutionary argument? No, none. Right? In terms of, there's no difference in the sense in both cases. All I'm telling you is my background, either evolutionary background or my social background, affects my tendency to do things. But it doesn't answer anything about whether it's right or wrong to behave that way. And I can think of many, many other examples of that nature. So I often get asked, hasn't evolution explained away our moral ideas? No, it hasn't. It may or may not have explained, we can be agnostic about that, whether it has or hasn't explained some tendencies we have. I'm a bit of a skeptic of a lot of that literature, but I could be wrong. I don't think it really matters that much. It's still interesting to think about, right? But in the end of the day, whether it's right or wrong to be faithful to your spouse is a moral question that science directly can't answer. Science can tell you various things about it, but it can't tell you whether it's right or wrong. The right or wrong comes from somewhere else. Does that make sense? Well, let's skip this. Mechanism of meaning. There's a very nice video yesterday that Julia did. One of the common, I'll repeat this again because it's a very famous example. John Polkinghorne makes the example. So one of the other kind of myths is if I explain something, I've explained it away. So if I've explained, for example, that something is biological, then I've explained it away. And the famous example is if you come to my house and water's boiling on the stove, you ask me why the water's boiling, I can give you a scientific explanation in terms of the mean square velocity of the water molecules is directly proportional to temperature. When that reaches 100 degrees Celsius, you get a phase transition from a condensed phase to an expanded phase, which you call boiling, right? But you can ask me, why is the water boiling? And I can say, I fancy a cup of tea if I'm in England, or a cup of coffee if I'm here. Would you like one? Right? And those are complementary explanations. So there's many things that we can explain, but it doesn't tell us that we therefore have explained everything about it. Just like we sometimes call this nothing buttery. If I explain to you that human beings are made of chemicals, very quickly in the kind of way that science gets abused, we're nothing but chemicals, right? So human beings are made of chemicals, but imagine that I say to you, well, in fact, it turns out that human beings are made of enough phosphorus for 2,000 matches, enough iron for 1 nail, there's enough chlorine in you to disinfect a swimming pool, and there's enough fat in you for about 10 bars of soap. That's kind of interesting, right? But if I tell you that you are nothing but chemicals, you're nothing but these things, you instinctively feel something's wrong with it, right? And so it's really important. We call this nothing buttery. So I've explained something, and therefore you are nothing but that thing. That's a myth. It's a myth. It's just not correct. How are we doing on time? I think I'm almost done. Math can't measure the value of human life. I did that already. These are the false binaries. This is another myth. I call this a false binary. Faith is a great cop-out, a great excuse to evade the need to think and value evidence. Faith is belief in spite of, or perhaps because of, lack of evidence. It's kind of nonsense, okay? Faith is a complicated thing, but evidence is a very big part of our faith. So in that little movie, I gave that example to Morgan Freeman, but I'll repeat it again. So let's say I look at my, like this is an idea. The idea I got is from my friend. The story comes from my friend Bill Newsom, who's a very famous neuroscientist at Stanford, one of the world's greatest neuroscientists. And he's walking across the Stanford campus one day, and his colleague said we should blow, this is called the Memorial Chapel in Stanford. It's a very beautiful chapel. And his colleague said we should blow this thing up because it's a monument to irrationality. And then Bill said, well, in that case, because it's not scientific, therefore a monument to irrationality. So Bill said, well, if it's not scientific, then we should blow up my house too, because my decision to get married and to have children was also not scientific. And his colleague goes, whoa, what do you mean? And the story goes a bit like this. I'll give you my own story. So when I decided to get married, if I wanted to get married and went out on the street and grabbed the first and best woman I saw and said, marry me, that would be an irrational thing, okay? In fact, if she said yes, it'd be even more irrational. And so what we do is we get to know the other person, we ask ourselves, what do our friends or people we respect think about them, even do these kind of compatibility tests. These my wife and I did, they did ask like 100 questions. where do you squeeze a toothpaste and that kind of stuff. But you don't marry somebody because you both score 95% on compatibility tests. There's more to it. And part of the difficulty is that I don't know what it's like to get married until I'm married. So there's evidence that I will never have. If I want to do repeatable experiments in marriage, right, that doesn't really, that's not what I want to do. Right? And so there's an aspect to getting married, which is a step of faith, because there's evidence that I will only see once I am married. And most important things in life have that character to them. So when we become Christians, you know, we think about these things. Is there evidence? Is it true? We worry about things. But sometimes there's evidence we'll never see until we make a step of faith and believe in God, because God then reveals things to us as we grow in our faith. Right? And so this kind of evidentialist idea that somehow faith and science faith is irrational is a kind of silly. It's perfectly rational to get married in these kinds of. It's perfectly rational to get married, even though you don't know what it's really going to be like until you're married. It doesn't make it irrational. It doesn't make it irrational to get married. Right? That's just the way the world is. And our Christian faith has many things like that. Another example would be, if I say to my wife, I'm going to be an evidentialist, rationalist about the fact that she loves me. I'm not going to believe, I'm going to assume that she doesn't love me until I see evidence of her love. Okay, that I could do that. Everybody would know is that this means I will actually miss a lot of love, right? Because she will not be very happy with that attitude, and that will affect our relationship. Instead, I believe that she loves me, and as I believe that my love for her grows, and her love for me grows, and these grow. Now, I can't be completely rational about it. If I know that at some point she says to me, "I hate you," or "I'm going to leave," right? I have to realize that that's broken down. So it's not like I'm being stupid about it, but if I take this kind of scientific stance on it, I will miss evidence. So the real story is the world is much more rich and much more complicated than science. Science's great power comes from limiting itself to extremely small subset of questions that it can answer extremely well. And it's really important not to get confused between the power of science to explain, you know, the Higgs boson, or maybe even symmetry in protein clusters, from answers to the big questions of life, like is it good to be married? Is it good to be faithful? What should I do with my life? What's the purpose of life? What's the meaning of life? All those kinds of questions. Those are questions that come from other sources. And they come from other sources for everybody. Even Richard Dawkins has a bunch of other sources from which he gets this kind of information. He may think he's using science, but he's not. It's just because science doesn't answer those questions. And those are my zombie myths. And so that's the end of my little presentation on this. Any questions?
I still have a follow-up question to your argument from beauty and natural theology. And I'm interested in how do you deal with the problematic side of it. Let's say we look at the sunrise and think it's beautiful, therefore we connect it in some way to God, and that it tells us something about God. But you could also look at an evil side of nature, animal eating each other, or like the evolutionary the survival of the fittest. How can you be logically consistent without having to say, therefore God also is an evil?
That's a super good question. So the question is, how do you do natural theology? Is how do you extract theology from nature? I would say, if you read somebody like Richard Dawkins, that he's fundamentally a natural theologian. And so one of his most famous quotes is, can get it right. Basically, what he tells us, if we look at this world, we see nothing, no goods, no evil, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. It's a very famous quote. He says, there's no good, there's no evil, there's just, all you see there was blind, pitiless indifference. He's looking at part of the natural world where this is what it looks like to him. And so if you read his books, he gives lots of nice explanations of science, and then he sometimes suddenly says, this means there is no good, no evil. Other places, he's inconsistent with this, but that's one of his natural theological arguments. So the reason why I'm cautious about this is this is one of the greatest theologians of our time, Karl Barth, who wrote an article called Nein. Okay, I've always wanted to write an article where the title was No. Okay, and the No was against natural theology. So he basically said, I believe in Jesus Christ, God's Son, our Lord, in order to perceive and understand that God Almighty, the Father, is creator of heaven and earth. If I did not believe the former, I would not perceive and understand the latter. Okay? So very famously, Barth, if you're a theologian in the audience, you know that Barth is an anti-natural theologian and said, you can't look at the natural, and what he was getting at is, whenever we look at the natural world, we come with some assumptions about it. So Richard Dawkins is looking at the natural world, I assume there's no God, I look, it's telling me there is no good, no evil. But he actually comes in it with his perspective. As a Christian, you look at the natural world and you see things that really point you towards the beauty of God, but you're coming at it with that perspective. And so Barth's one take of theologians is to say, you know, you're always so affected by your prior views that you can't really trust anything to give you any truth. It's just reflecting back what you already see. That's the anti-natural theology argument. And so Barth said, therefore, it's dangerous to do natural theology. In Oxford, Alistair McGrath, who you see a picture of here, has tried to bring back natural theology into the theological folds. And his argument is, the way we should do it is we should ask ourselves, if we are Christians and then we look at the world, do we see something that makes more sense of the world than if we take an assumption there's no God and then look at the world? So we should just be conscious of the first step that we're taking and then look at the world and ask ourselves which of these two weaves the best consistent story, which is the most consistent story of what we see. And it's true that if you look at nature, you see both things that look good and things that look evil. So it's not actually quite as unambiguous as you might think. And that's all I'm saying. So I'm saying for you that those of you that want to talk about science in the public or with your friends, it's perfectly fine to point them towards God, because I think we do sense something of the divine when we look at nature, but it's not unambiguous. So if you're really into this kind of stuff, you can read Alistair, who's engaging with people like Barth and others who are very worried about natural theology. And it's also very interesting that if you then read popularizers like Richard Dawkins and others, to think, are these people doing natural theology? Are they looking at nature and telling me this is what the world is, what theology is like, or what philosophy is like by looking at the natural world? And they often are doing it. That's basically my take.
You opened your talk with the ideology of atheism that says, well, in the mid-age everything was dark, and well, we needed God because we did not know enough. But now we do not enough. We do know enough, and now we're enlightened, so we do not need science anymore. And I'm thinking of a book of Harari, the short history of mankind, where he uses the example of Anthony van Leeuwenhoek who developed the microscope. And so he said, okay, well, that was one major scientist who helped us to get enlightened, in order not to need God anymore.
Yeah.
And so, because I know a little bit of Dutch, I made just a few minutes research on Van Leeuwenhoek, who lived in Delft, and you just pointed on his Reformed church in Delft, where he says about his own biography, I wanted to get as close as possible to God, which is why I invented the microscope.
Yeah. Really? That's really nice. Yeah. No, so Harari. So you guys know Harari is a very popular writer. That's something interesting. His PhD supervisor he was his PhD at Oxford, and I'm friends. His PhD supervisor and I are the two faculty members who represent for the undergraduate student union, the VBG equivalent. So his PhD supervisor is a very strong Christian. Harari is a classic positivist atheist. And there's a really nice article I just recently read by give me a second. I think I might even have it on my laptop, so I'm going to just find it for you. I think some of the things that I'm saying. Oh no, it's actually not this. I will try to find it for you later. But basically, I'm terrible with names. Nick Spencer. So there's a British writer called Nick Spencer. He's written about 3 years ago in the ABC, which is the Australian Broadcasting Network, a really good review of Harari's books. And he basically points out that, so Harari, do you guys know these books like Deus? He's written these books that have sold 10 million copies. They're big history books, right? So you see them in every airport thing. And they are, so big history is the idea that you give this big grand historical story, and part of his story is that, human beings did all these things that cause problems, but also part of it is he actually believes that, humans, he believes that humans have no, that morality is an illusion. He says it in his books. He believes that basically we're just evolving machines. It's quite dark and quite silly, and so he's not a very reliable historian. And it's kind of interesting because that's a good example of historical popularization by somebody who tells a very attractive story that looks like a really great story, but when you start looking at it in more detail, a lot of significant details are wrong, like the one that you pointed out, right? And so historians have generally not been very happy with his work. But it's very attractive, so it sold tens of millions because it tells a grand story, and part of that grand story is the story of us. He's very much, we were in the Dark Ages, now we're enlightened. And who would not want to be enlightened, right? So it's very attractive, right? So if you think about it, it's like a religious type of story, right? Here's our religious story. We used to be very primitive, now we're enlightened. Look at us, isn't that great? Hallelujah. That's effectively, that sells very well. It made him a very rich man. And some of the things are interesting stories, but there's enough kind of stuff that's simply not intellectually credible in there. And this article about this Nick Spencer article, ABC, so you look at Australian Broadcasting Corporation, Nick Spencer, Nick-Spencer, he's a very good writer in London. And that will, you read that, and then you read the book, the Harari books again, and you look at it with completely different, and actually what you'll ask yourself is, why did this book become so popular? Why is everybody reading it when it's making really kind of crazy comments of this nature? That's the interesting question.
I'm still figuring out the right words, but you showed this graphic of faith or science, that faith is bigger than science.
Yeah.
My question is your faith in any way falsifiable? If yes,
yeah.
Does science and faith not still have like this connecting method?
Well, so I think so. What I'm trying to say is, I think when we talk about faith, I mean the bigger picture, including like faith includes things like where my moral values come from. Those are non-scientific questions. Everybody has this bigger set of things that they believe on other grounds than science. Science is a small subset of that. But science can impinge on our so if we believe as, I can believe in very vaguely in theism, right? I can believe in the God of the Bible, and Jesus Christ who rose from the dead. That's perfectly falsifiable. If one day we find the bones of Jesus Christ and they are still in the grave, and we can somehow clearly see this is Jesus Christ, then our faith is wrong. Right? Our faith has to be falsifiable in that way. Right? There's many other ways it would be falsifiable. So, if you look at, there's many different religious beliefs which are perfectly falsifiable. If you believe that, there was a lost tribe of Israel who migrated over to North America a long time ago, that's falsifiable, right? You need to find evidence for it at some points. And so it is falsifiable. Science does, or rational thinking can help undermine your faith. That's not something that Christians should be afraid of. It's just they should be super cautious to make sure that the rational thinking they use doesn't already presuppose no God when it starts. So I don't think Christians should be afraid of rational thinking at all. I think good rational thinking is really important. But you should be, that's part of our faith. Right? Our faith is more than that. Right? Just like my relationship with my wife is more than me just, I have evidence that she loves me, but the fact is there's more to it than just, I don't assume that she doesn't love me unless I see evidence. That's just a weird way of interacting, an unhealthy way. And so a healthy way of interacting with is more rich, more complicated. So my point of that big circle is to say there are many aspects of our lives, everybody's lives, that are not in science. I can take another side. There may be aspects of science that I don't know how to fit into my faith at this point. I don't really know how that works. I don't quite understand it. and that's totally fine. Right? The world is very complicated. There are many things that I don't quite know how it fits into the big framework, but I do believe that eventually it will. So let me give you one example of that. So in Newton's case, right, where he believed that the planets orbit around basically there's a comet that came and fixed the planets every so often. Well, Newton let go of that idea, and that idea never became popular. But let's say that idea had become popular. People said, we know that God exists because without God, the planets would be unstable. So in the 1800s, a very famous, in the late 1800s, Pierre-Simon Laplace, who's a very famous French mathematician, wrote a 5-volume Celestial Mechanics. And one of the stories, apocryphal stories probably, is that he went to Napoleon and presented these books. And Napoleon said, where's God? And Laplace said, I have no need for that hypothesis. It's not clear because Laplace was actually a Catholic, whether he actually said that or not, but it's often said as this is how science has, as advanced and atheism came along, is how it's told. What Laplace was really doing, he was bragging. He was saying, I've done better calculations than Newton, and in my better calculations, the planets are stable. That was the point of his things. So then Christians say, oh no, our argument for faith has dropped, right? We don't need God for the planets. Then, over the years afterwards, people did the calculations to higher order, more complicated, and then the planets became unstable again. So Laplace is actually wrong, right? So then Christians would say, yeah, now our faith is good again, right? And it's only recently, with what we call chaotic systems, which is a very complicated piece of mathematics, that we realize that our solar system has little islands of stability, which is why our planets are stable. And you need big computers to make those calculations to show that the thing is stable. So what this tells me is sometimes it's good for Christians just to say we don't know, right? And if we had a theological bone in that argument, we could have it would take a very long time for us to understand what's actually happening. Sometimes it's good to take a step back and just say, we don't know, we don't need to know, we don't need to it's not that important. We can fit it in later. It might take 100 years or 200 years before we understand that science well enough to be able to make theological conclusions about what it's telling us. But the most important thing is that I'm very confident that there's a bigger picture of the world than just science. Even if I was an atheist, I would believe there's a bigger picture of the world than just science. I don't see how you can't believe that. There is a bigger picture of the world. Science only is a small part of that world. Right? And the only difference is between myself and my atheist friends who are thoughtful about this is we've got different ideas about where moral values and ultimate values come from and what they are. And so I'm very happy to discuss them with them, but let's not pretend that science is telling us anything about it. It's not.
You know that Alan famously stated this evolutionary argument against naturalism.
Yeah.
What do you think about it? Do you use it in your apologetics?
I don't. So the evolutionary argument against naturalism. So Alvin Plantinga is a very famous Christian philosopher. So I should. He's much better philosopher than I am. But his evolutionary argument, naturalism, is basically something like this, which is the kinds of pressures in the African savanna when our humans first evolved are not the kinds of things that would give us the mental powers to do modern science. So therefore, we shouldn't trust on those grounds alone. It's very unlikely that our mental powers would allow us to understand the kinds of things we do. So therefore, naturalism is self-defeating. Right? There's a similar argument Sharon Street makes, an evolutionary argument against moral realism, which is that if there are moral truths that are out there, it's very unlikely that our evolutionary history would allow us to have access to them. So these are all in a category of evolutionary debunking arguments. I'm not a big fan of these arguments. I think these arguments make huge amounts of assumptions about what may or may not have happened on the African savanna, and we don't really know what happened. Evidence is very low. And so I'm not sure that argument runs that far. I think there are better arguments you can make than that. My short answer. I don't use it in apologetics because I think I'm suspicious about how much we can know about what happened in our evolutionary past and how much we can say whether we did or didn't have access to this kind of thinking. Obviously, our minds are able to do all kinds of really interesting things where it's unclear that would have had any adaptive advantage a long time ago. But why that is could be all kinds of reasons. Christians obviously think, if you're a Christian, you can have many views on how God created the world, and that's all fine. If you believe that God created the world over time, and so that humans, one of the arguments that God created human beings so they would one day have enough rational capacity to engage with Him, interact with Him. That was why God made human beings. And that's clearly the case, that we have that capacity to think about Him and engage with Him. And we would say that's something that God desired, and God set up the world such that that would occur. Yeah, I'm not basically, I'm not such a fan of those arguments because I think, so evolutionary arguments, so actually we do a lot of work on evolution. I think evolution is very interesting, but these kinds of arguments, evolutionary psychology, that there's a lot of what we call just so stories. So just so stories from Kipling, right? So why the tiger got its spots. So you can always tell a story, an adaptive story that explains all kinds of things. They're very hard to debunk, right? They're very hard to undermine. So I'm less of a fan of them. That's part of that has nothing to do with apologetics. Just scientifically, I think they are hard. I think there's a lot of speculation and very little empirical evidence for them. But you're welcome. I mean, it's interesting to use.
I think the interesting fact about this argument, maybe as I understand it, is that he said that, okay, considering there is a God, then science and using our rationality makes much more sense.
Yeah.
Than if everything is just coincidence, right? Including our thoughts and our thoughts we do about science.
Yeah, exactly. That's the argument is that's the argument. And the argument is coincidence, not just coincidence. The fact is that those things evolved in a way that's recognizing dangerous animals and being good at hunting are not the kinds of thought processes that allow you to do science, right? Or abstract mathematics would be another example. So being able to count is very different from being able to solve very complicated differential equations or do algebraic topology. And so why do we have this ability to go way beyond that? And that's the argument. I think you can cut that argument loose from evolution entirely and say it's very surprising that we have these high-level capacities to think about things. On naturalism, so that just on naturalism, it would be surprising that that's true. On theism, it's not surprising. So this was this kind of Bayesian argument. When you take your starting point into is the evidence that accumulates for your hypothesis, the evidence is much stronger if you start with the assumption of theism. So the evidence is in favor of theism, increases the probability of theism, but doesn't increase or decrease the probability of atheism. That's another way of taking his arguments out.
Well, I'm neither a physicist nor a philosopher. I'm just a physician. But, so my question might be really dumb. So I want to excuse myself in advance. When it comes to the word faith, I have a question in that context. If I'm a scientist, I want to pursue an idea that my hypothesis is able to be proved, meaning I need the faith that there is a concept of truth, a reliable frame of reference where my hypothesis fits in.
Yeah.
So how is it possible to separate truth in a secular and a spiritual truth, or is it? My feel is that it's not possible to make that separation.
I think these are very good questions. So I think the point you're making is even when you're a scientist, you have to take steps of faith, right? And people do this all the time. And that steps of faith are not too dissimilar to the kinds of steps of faith we make in our Christian lives, right? The hypotheses maybe are different, and so it's important to realize. I think what I'm trying to say is exactly what you're trying to say, is that actually, even in science, we make certain faith steps. And that's just the way the world is. So on that particular topic, there's a famous philosopher called Michael Polanyi, who's written a lot about exactly that kind of, that question. Polanyi, Polyani. A-N-I. And don't read him directly, but you can read people that comment on him and it'll be easier to understand. But a lot of Christian. I think Polkinghorne writes about him. I think if you go on the Faraday Institute website, that first one, you can find some things on it. My main point about all this is to say, so I've actually not talked very much about science at all, but maybe about kind of more philosophical background ideas, because I think those are the ones that are underlying the debate in many ways. They're often harder to dislodge if you're talking to somebody who believes one of these zombie myths, for example, because they may or may not realize that they're actually making a bunch of assumptions behind the scenes that they don't recognize. And so part of the job of good apologetics is to help people understand what they are thinking. And that's hard. But my goal is twofold: to help you think about these things a little bit and kind of get some idea about them, find some things to read. And my other goal is to make sure that Christians, I know from experience, Christians are often a little bit worried about science. They fear that if they get too deep in it, science is going to pull their faith away. And I think it can, but it's not because of the science itself. It's because of certain types of bad thinking. And actually, it should be the other way around.
So, thank you so much, Ard.
Thank you.
Ja, vielleicht gerade kurz als kleine Anfrage, wie es weitergeht. Wir machen um 12:45 Uhr, also in wenigen Minuten, machen wir hier noch ein Schlussplenum. Und es wäre total schön, wenn ihr alle das noch bleibt. Noch ein paar spannende Informationen von uns. 12:45 Uhr, kurze Pause noch. Gastredner.